Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome to NOAA's National Ocean Service Science Seminar Series. My name is Tracy Gill and I'm co-hosting this National Climate Assessment Seminar Series with Katie Reeves, who is the Engagement and Communications Lead at the U.S. Global Change Research Program. I will provide a few seminar logistics and then Katie will provide info on the seminar series and introduce the seminar and speakers. But before she does, here are a few logistics. There are 3 presenters today, so we will allow only a few questions after the first talk, as long as we can start the second talk at 1:30 to give time for the second presentation. People in the room, please sign in and mute your phone. And if you're interested in getting a PDF copy or recording of today's presentation, Katie will list the relevant websites on the chat box. If you are interested in being on NOAA's weekly science seminar list, please email me at tracy.gill@noaa.gov and I will be happy to add you. And now I will hand it over to Katie Reeves to introduce the seminar. Katie?
Great, thanks. Thanks, Tracy, and thank you to NOAA for hosting the 3rd installment of our webinar series focused on the findings of the 4th National Climate Assessment. We're so happy you've joined us on what's hopefully a short work week for many of you. I'm Katie Reeves, the Engagement and Communications Lead for the U.S. Global Change Research Program, or USGCRP. For your information, if you haven't joined us before, the Global Change Research Act of 1990 mandates that USGCRP assists the nation and the world to understand, assess, predict, and respond to human-induced and natural processes of global change. One way that we do that is through the development of a quadrennial national climate assessment. The 4th assessment was released in 2 volumes. The first, the Climate Science Special Report, was released in November of 2017 and was covered in an earlier webinar series, which can be found on our website, www.globalchange.gov/engage/webinars, and I will drop that link into the chat box when we're done, so you don't have to hurry up and write it down. The second volume, Impacts, Risks, and Adaptation in the United States, is the focus of this series. As the title indicates, NCA4 Volume 2 assesses the observed and projected impacts of climate change across the U.S., covering 17 national-level topics in 10 regions. The assessment was released in November 2018, and you can read and download it at nca2018.globalchange.gov, and I think I've already dropped that one in the chat box. Today, I'm pleased to introduce 3 of our authors, Jim Wickham, Jim Vose, and Dave Peterson, as they present on land cover, land use change in forests in a changing climate, findings from the 4th National Climate Assessment. Dr. Jim Wickham is a research biologist with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Prior to joining EPA in 1998, Jim worked with Tennessee Valley Authority, Desert Research Institute, and Earth Satellite Corporation. He has a broad interest in the environmental impacts of spatial and temporal land cover patterns and coordinates EPA's participation in the Multi-Resolution Land Characteristics Consortium, a group of 10 federal agencies that produces the National Land Cover Database, the Cropland Data Layer, and the Coastal Change Analysis Program, and Wildfire. Dr. Jim Vose is a senior research ecologist with the USDA Forest Service Southern Research Station in the Center for Integrated Forest Science at Research Triangle Park in North Carolina. Prior to his current appointment as co-director of CIFS, he spent 25 years at the Coweta Hydrologic Laboratory studying and leading research on watershed ecosystem responses to disturbances and forest management. Dr. Vose's current research examines the interactions among climate change, changing forest conditions, and water resources at landscape scales. And Dr. Dave Peterson is Emeritus Senior Research Scientist with the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station and Professor of Forest Biology at the University of Washington School of Environmental and Forest Sciences. He's conducted research on climate change and fire science throughout Western North America, has published 230 scientific articles and 4 books, and was contributing author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He recently published the book Climate Change in Rocky Mountain Ecosystems, and currently works on climate change assessment and adaptation on federal lands throughout the western United States. Thank you so much for joining us for today's NOAA Science Seminar, and over to you, Dr. Wickham.
Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes,
you can.
Great.
Okay, great. Thanks. Thanks for everybody for joining in. Good morning to those in Western time zones and afternoon to those in the East. I'm going to talk to you about Chapter 5, which was the Land Cover and Land Use Change chapter in NCA4. As you can see on the slide there, that Ben Sleeter was the lead author for this effort, and I'm substituting for him today. In addition, myself, Grant Domke from the Forest Service, Nate Harold from NOAA, and Nathan Wood from USGS were contributing authors. And I want to give a special shout out to Georgine Yorgi. She was very, very helpful in editing our chapter. Yeah. So I thought I would start here. Some of this is in the chapter, some of it's not, but I was looking at this from the, I guess, the introduction, chapter front matter, and I wonder sometimes how much of the folks that fall into these sectors really understand the relationships of climate change and land cover, so I just wanted to start there. Particularly, I wonder for this audience how much they recognize how the sun's radiation is distributed, how that 70% of the energy you feel when you walk outside comes from the earth, not from the sun, and how the work that energy does is distributed across 3 different types of heat: evaporation, convection, and thermal radiation, and how that changes from not only with geography but also with land cover. Of course, when you large transpiring vegetation surfaces, when they're active, there won't be 25% of that heat going to evaporation. And I thought this was a good way to introduce these concepts. This article is dated now. I don't think it was in NCA4, but they were observing some declines in the summer afternoon thunderstorms in Florida over the years. And so the folks at Colorado State and USGS applied the RAMS model both before and after European settlement, and found that land cover changes are responsible for changes in sea breeze structure and strength, the spatial distribution of rainfall, July and August precipitation totals, and you can read on down the list there. And so the model did replicate what they were observing. You know, one of the things we can take away from this is land cover has changed the climate of Florida, based on this research. More recent research, this is not an NCA4, obviously, it's in India, but more recent research is corroborating what Marshall and others found for the Indian Peninsula, a place that has at least some geographic similarities and climate similarities. But this is a more recent corroborating study where decreases in forest and increases in ag have essentially reduced the buoyancy of the atmosphere and reduced precipitation totals, made things warmer and drier. So a lot of what we do in the land cover chapter is talk about some of these changes in land cover and land use. I'm not going to go into the differences between land cover and land use in this talk because of time limitations. Since the publication of NCA4, the National Land Cover Database has produced its 2016 version, and so we're able to get 16 or 15 years of land cover change over the continental United States. I know those numbers are probably too small for folks to read, and the individual cell values aren't really that important. The net take home there is at the bottom. And I'm not going to show a picture of this, I apologize, but about half of the land cover change occurs in the coastal regions of the United States. You probably can't read the totals there, but there's nearly 3 million hectares of new urban land cover since 2001, and about 6 million hectares of forest cover loss. And I have cover underlined there, and this goes back to the land use. A lot of this has to do with forestry practices and things of that nature. And so a lot of this would be considered, some of these land cover changes would be considered the same use over time. NLCD would see it as change from forest to grassland after it's harvested. The Forest Service would not see it that way. That's still a forest use. So it's not 6 million acres of forest loss. We had a simple structure. We looked at 2 key messages. How does land cover influence weather and climate? And it's reciprocal. How does climate influence land cover and ecosystems? So I'll just highlight some of the main topics that were covered in the first key message. Temperate forests promote cooling rather than warming, the influence of fire on climate, effective urbanization, and irrigated agriculture. So if you go back into the literature, say in the 2000s, there's a fair amount of literature about actually outside the tropics, deforestation was a cooling agent. And what the people in the general circulation model world were pointing out is that, yes, you have forests are a big carbon sink, but they're also dark and they have a low albedo, and you have to look at that as well. And so they were showing in the temperate latitudes either a neutral or a negative, or either a neutral effect or a cooling effect as a result of deforestation. And the picture on the left is showing that. I thought that was a good picture. The gray arrow is carbon sequestration, the blue arrow is evaporation, and the red arrow is albedo. And they're trying to show you that for the tropical on the left, temperate in the middle, and boreal on the right. I apologize for not labeling those. And you can see how some of those arrows change and why this was being researched in the literature. Most of that ended in the around 2010. You can still find some articles on that, but there's been a lot of articles since that looking a lot at MODIS data and some other factors that are showing that the surface temperature data does not reflect that, and some of the surface air temperature data as well. And so the picture on the right is looking at a long time series of just the wintertime temperatures in the southeast and showing where you have forests that are cooler year-round, so they're cooler in the winter as well as the spring, summer, and fall, and separating from the tiles in the pink, the cells in the pink, where they're generally, forests are generally a little bit warmer in the winter. Lots of times overall in those cells that are pink that they have an annual total that promotes cooler, that suggests cooler than surrounding herbaceous vegetation. So this was new since NCA4. The other thing we tried to talk about with, we wanted to talk about with fire was how the actual fire increases that we're seeing, and I'm sure Jim and Dave are going to talk about this in the second half of today. This also has the potential to change climate. just because of the land cover change. So we know that the fire releases carbon and other greenhouse gases. That's going to promote warming. It may reduce surface albedo, at least temporarily, which will promote warming. And they also release a lot of aerosols to the atmosphere, which promote cooling. We wanted to introduce this topic. There's not a lot on how that might affect climate going into the future, whether it'll influence local or regional climate. But we wanted to at least introduce it. I'm sure we put a low confidence on this, but we thought it was an important thing to introduce. Urbanization is a topic that was, something that was in NCA4. We wanted to point out with sort of make an emphasis on this, that urbanization was in fact climate change. I think that actually got edited out, but anyway, you see up the first bullet there, there's about 5 or 6 different factors that make urbans so different from vegetated agriculture or natural vegetation that dramatically change the climate of the local area or sometimes the regional area. When we looked at the literature sort of suggested that the impact of climate change was going to be greater in urban areas in the east than the west. And there was some emerging research about how the urbanization is going to affect downwind precipitation patterns. Right now, I'd say that information is sort of equivocal. Some folks are finding it gives you sort of a range how it'll affect. Others are showing that it increases precipitation downwind. And I just wanted to point out also that when we talk about land cover and how it's going to change climate, usually we're talking large changes. When general circulation models are run, they're usually talking about large changes. As we were doing this research, we did sort of look at this at China for context, and I apologize that I have a citation there in yellow. That is a thumb drive accident. When I was doing this work, I had those papers. I since have, that thumb drive is broken, and you can't go to Google and say, please give me all the ones that I've lost. And I haven't been able to find it. But there are some papers that saying the amount of urbanization that is going on in China has affected the climate regionally, has made it warmer. So I apologize for missing that citation. And I just wanted to, I don't know if this picture communicates it very well, but that is a heck of a lot of urbanization. If you look at the 3 main red dots down here at the south, that's Hong Kong. The middle one at 30 degrees latitude is Shanghai, and up here is Beijing. Along that latitude band is essentially Miami to Philadelphia. Philadelphia is at 40 degrees latitude. Jacksonville's at 30. We do not see urbanization anything like this, and you can see over in the right-hand side that amount of urbanization over a 20-year period that's about 10 years earlier than what I showed for NLCD is more than twice the amount of urbanization that we've seen in a similar period. I think and I guess I just like folks to think about, what if we saw this amount of urbanization, what would we be saying about its impact on climate change? So key message 2, we talked about agriculture and food security, wildland fire. I'm sure Dave and Jim are going to talk about that. And we did put in some information about sort of ecosystem changes, forest to shrubland conversion, and poleward migration of mostly eastern U.S. forests. So with with agriculture and food security, we wanted to again introduce a concept that I don't believe has been discussed before. It's the notion of geographic shifts in cropland location. And I particularly put this picture where the Minnesota and Mississippi River come together because I'm involved in a project where this is a concern. We have a water quality study looking out with land use scenarios out to say 2050 for the Minneapolis drinking water treatment facility. And one of the reasons they're interested in this is because they think that, or they're concerned that there's going to be a northward migration of agriculture. And so the geography is not shown in this picture, but the Mississippi River flows, the confluence with the Minnesota is south of Minneapolis of 20, 30 miles. I'm not sure exactly how much. It's relatively close. Minneapolis draws its water off the Mississippi River on the north side of the city, and that area is north of that. The Mississippi watershed is fairly abundant in natural vegetation. Where the Minnesota River comes through, that drains a lot of agriculture in Minnesota, and you can see the difference there in the water qualities with the difference in the sediment loads, particularly. So this is something that we may see in the future. Some changes in the geographic location of cropland. We talked a little bit about the shifts to irrigated agriculture in the Great Plains, and you can actually see this in the growth of pivot irrigation as you look at NLCD over time, especially where I remember it is eastern Nebraska. And then we also covered what has been the dominant topic for this area, for this sort of sector, which is the negative impact of warming on yields. Yeah, so that's that. I'm probably repeating with wildland fire a little bit of what Jim and Dave are going to talk about, but the fires are expected to increase over time. We cite one study there that was put in the chapter, talking about how the fuel aridity, the amount of area burned, has been increased, and it's attributable to anthropogenic-induced climate change, and it's expected to continue as long as fuels are not limiting, and perhaps increase in the southeast. Not going to spend a lot of time here. I'm getting close here, but we did talk a little bit about shrub encroachment on particularly western forests and poleward migrations, and there are models that show that. Of course, most of these models can't incorporate some of the local ecology, and so it's difficult to assess the validity of some of these results, but a lot of models are showing some of these changes. So I just wanted to close up with a few slides looking back and looking forward. So we really had, in this version, in the fourth version, we really had sort of a reciprocal focus on the key messages. The key messages in NCA4 were more of a societal focus, and I tried to list there how they match up across time. We'll keep going here. Again, just sort of some take-home messages to influence, emphasis on the influence of land cover on climate, which I'd say in NCA4 it was more key message 2, and you can read the rest of those. The two biggest ones are temperate reforestation promotes cooling, and the introduction of climate change, on the impact of climate change on the spatial distribution of agriculture. And I did want to mention, just looking forward a little bit, about what for the land cover chapter should perhaps be on the radar for NCA5. How fast are those forests recovering with this longer and increased fire cycle? We probably have the data to take a shot at looking at that issue. The same for the spatial distribution of cropland between some land use change models like 4C and the cropland data layer, which is being used for a lot more than its intended use, effectively used. That's another thing that's worth looking at. I think there's probably going to be more in the literature about the effect of urbanization on precipitation patterns. I was concerned that we didn't put permafrost in for the land cover chapter. It is in the Alaska chapter. It's mostly focused on, logically focused on the effect of the permafrost as opposed to the mapping and the estimate of extent. And perhaps that's a place that could be a stronger linkage going forward. And I think I'll just stop there. So hopefully that gives Jim and Dave some time. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Jim. And Katie's going to do a little talking while I get the other slide deck up.
Sure thing, I can do that. If you do have questions, please type them in the box. The one other thing that I will note that I think will be really useful, I've put the link to the land cover and land use change chapter in the text in the chat box here. The other thing I would just like to note is that if you're interested in downloading that chapter or just the executive summary, figures, or even a chapter-specific PowerPoint for the land use chapter or the forest chapter or any of our 29 chapters, you can do that here. I'm dropping this into the inbox, or into the chat box, nca2018.globalchange.gov/downloads. And it looks like we are set for our next talk. So please take it away, Jim and Dave.
Okay, this is Jim Vose. Hopefully you can hear me all right. I'm going to kick us off here, and Dave and I are going to split the talk up a little bit. As the title says, we're going to hit some of our highlights from the forest chapter of the NCA4. And I'm from the eastern U.S. and Dave's from the western U.S., and so we had a nice sort of balanced perspective on the issues facing U.S. forests related to climate change. I think that there were kind of three important aspects of our chapter that built on NCA4. I think one of the most important things is that a lot of the predictions that were reported in NCA4 were observed and certainly realized in the years between NCA4 and NCA4. A lot of those changes not only happened but were accelerated as a result of climate variability and change. The other aspect I think that's different between NCA4 and NCA4 is that intervening time really added some additional insight on slow changes. Most of what we focus on are the big things that we see in the news or big things we see in changing forests like fire or large-scale drought. But there's been a lot of additional research on slower changes, especially in eastern forests and especially in diverse forests. And then finally, one of the aspects that we really emphasized, and Dave in particular has continued to emphasize, is the adaptation. Taking the science information that we've learned from these assessments using that as information to help land managers decide on or evaluate different adaptation options, which will facilitate the ability of forests to be more resilient or resistant to current and future climate changes. So we're just going to give an overview of many of these aspects of the NCA4 forest chapter, and to hopefully have some time for questions at the end. Well, first and foremost is we had a great team. Dave and I were the convening lead authors, and then many co-authors from the Forest Service. Note that Grant Domke was a co-author on the land use chapter as well. And as you could hear or see from Jim's previous presentation, the land use or land cover component of the nation's land base, forest is a really important component of that, especially for carbon dynamics. So we did have some cross-fertilization with the land use, land cover chapter as well. Other experts from the Forest Service in a variety of disciplines. And then we had a substantial number of technical contributors who essentially functioned like co-authors, but because they were from universities, were technical contributors, but lots of input and lots of insight from our university technical contributors as well. So Dave, I think at this slide we pass it over to you.
Yes, and we have three key messages we're going to talk about today. The first one is ecological disturbance and forest health, and as Jim suggested, we feel like we're seeing an acceleration of some of these phenomena over the last few years since the NCA4 report came out, and a lot of validation of previous projections. So simply put, we expect that frequency and magnitude of disturbances will likely increase in future years, and that these disturbances will drive much of the change that we see in forest structure and function over time. The gradual climate change effects that Jim mentioned may be less severe on the surface, but will also have a significant long-term effect on forest productivity and on species distribution across large landscapes. First of all, let's talk about fire. We're getting into the fire season now throughout the United States. We've already had quite a few fires in certain places, and this has certainly been getting a lot of media attention in recent years. So it's not really rocket science that if the climate gets warmer and drier, that we'll have more fires. There are some other mitigating factors, including earlier snowmelt, particularly at high elevations in mountainous environments. Lower summer fuel moisture. The projection that we'll have lower precipitation in the summer seems to be bearing out, has a big effect. That essentially extends the part of the year during which fires can occur, often called fire season. It's also possible in some places the intensity and severity of fire, the intensity being energy release, the severity being the effects of fire on a forest, that those could increase, particularly if fuel loadings are high. We try to do some things about fuel loadings, but there's such an enormous landscape to take care of it it's very difficult. Jim Wickham already showed this figure in his presentation, so I'd like to reiterate this. This is the recent trend since 1984 of what we're seeing in total area burned in the United States. And you can see the direction of that curve, albeit with a lot of variation from year to year. Along with that, we see a very nice correlation with fire suppression spending by the federal government, as shown in the black line there. And this has been a significant issue for agencies like the Forest Service, for whose current budget, about 56% is currently spent on fire management alone. Just 20 years ago, that was only 15% of the budget. So we can see this is a pretty rapid change in terms of how we are managing public lands and how those dollars are being spent. So just as an example of the scope of this phenomenon, we're going to focus in on the northwest corner of the continental United States for a moment. In 2015 and 2017, we had some real record fire years there, with over 9 million acres burned in the western U.S. alone. In 2018, over 7 million acres burned. So that's a lot of landscape, and if you start adding that up from year to year, you get big patches across certain areas of the landscape that have been burned. So this is why we're saying that these kinds of phenomena will have the biggest effect on future structure and function of forests. We're also finding that as fires accumulate across the landscape that they're starting to run into each other. And this is just an example from southwest Washington on the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, which is not a particularly arid location, where at least one area has burned 3 times in the last 10 years. This sort of thing is pretty much unprecedented in the historical record, and yet we're seeing this starting to occur at different locations in the western United States. I think this is a good sign that something is happening here that has not happened in the past and may happen more often in the future. It's pretty much overwhelmingly assumed that water balance deficit will increase in the future. And these are some projections from a recent paper by McKenzie and Littell across the western U.S. You can see it broken out by political boundaries in the top map and by ecoregions in the bottom map. But however you look at it, this is going to be the context for how we look at fire, drought, and other disturbances in the future. So it's almost, it's hard to imagine a future where we don't have more fires occurring during the summer months. Wildfire risk is also increasing in the eastern U.S. Now, you don't hear as much about this, perhaps, but fires in the east are historical occurrences ecologically, and due to some of the suppression efforts that we've done in both the east and the west, fuel loadings accumulate, and then when fires occur, they can be very severe. So in the southeastern U.S., we expect that lightning-caused fires will increase significantly over the next 40 years or so. Fires that have occurred in the southeast just in the past 5 years have included some rather amazing fires near urban areas, especially the one that recently occurred in Tennessee. So it seems, again, as if some of these things might be changing. And, it's not just fires burning forests, but it's fires burning places where people live. The abbreviation there, WUI, stands for Wildland-Urban Interface. And the wildland-urban interface continues to increase across both the west and the east. And smoke is a significant health factor for a lot of people. So again, it's not just the biological part of this that we're concerned about. We're concerned about how this will affect human populations and communities. Insects have been a big player. In fact, in any given year across the last 30 years or so, insects have actually killed more trees than fire, at least in the western United States. And here we see just kind of a conceptual diagram here. In 2016, the state of California had a remarkable landmark tree mortality event in the southern and central Sierra Nevada, where trees, mostly ponderosa pine, were killed by western pine beetles after several consecutive years of drought. So it's usually not just the drought that kills trees, but it's the interaction of multiple stressors, including bark beetles, that take advantage of that. So this has caused a big change, a big transformation in that landscape. Here's just a map for the mountain pine beetle, which has been kind of the poster child for climate change in the last 30 years or so. Across the western United States and western Canada, it has killed 50 million acres of forest, mostly lodgepole pine. This is an unprecedented sort of event ecologically. It has totally changed large areas of forest landscapes, and it's affected local communities and economies as well. And it's created a real conundrum for forest managers in terms of how do we manage these sorts of landscapes and how do we manage them for the future so this doesn't happen again. There's also been expansion of southern pine beetle. Now, southern pine beetle has been around as an endemic insect for many years, and it's a big consideration in our highly productive forests in the southern United States, mostly pine forest there. But as the climate has warmed, this insect is expanding into more northern locations. You can see all the dots there starting to occur in places like New Jersey, Massachusetts, New York, New Hampshire, and so forth. So it remains uncertain as to how resistant pine species in those states will be in the future. But what we do know is this is a situation that's changing rapidly, and we'll probably see some marked effects in recent years, especially if we have sustained droughts in this area. So the bottom line story here is that disturbances interact. Sometimes we call these stress complexes. So trees are pretty tough organisms in general, and they have high genetic diversity. But when you start hitting them with 2, 3, or 4 different stressors consecutively or at the same time, it may push them beyond the physiological threshold they have to resist that stress, especially if you have trees that are already low vigor, such as in very dense stands, sometimes old stands that are declining anyway. So this interaction is critical, and it points out to the fact that we need to look at all of these factors concurrently, not just one at a time. So we expect as drought becomes more common, insect outbreaks will become more common, and that as fires also spread across the landscape, they will interact not just directly, but in terms of this big mosaic of patches of disturbed areas that occur across large landscapes. And that in some cases, these changes will be persistent. Now, forests have experienced fire and insects for millions of years, and they are quite resistant, and they do regenerate. But in some places now, if you get a severe fire that removes much of the seed source, and at the same time the climate is getting warmer and it makes it difficult for trees to regenerate, you could get a transition to woodlands or shrublands. Basically, what we're assuming might be a permanent shift to a different vegetation type that will be different functionally and probably store much less carbon in the long run. So back to you, Jim.
All right. Yeah, so what Dave is focused on is some of the big, grand, extreme changes that are really shaping primarily western forests, but at times can impact eastern forests as well. But most of the change that we've observed and is predicted in eastern forests is more what we're calling long-term forest change. Is it a gradual shift in the growth rate, but also the types of species and distribution of species across the landscape. Because trees are long-lived and slow to move and slow to grow, there's many models that predict that at least in some locations that the rate of climate change is going to be faster than the existing or the current tree populations can adjust. And so it is in some of those areas where we might be able to see smaller scale mortality, but also changes in species compositions from species that require or flourish under wetter or cooler conditions or mesophytic species to species that do better and are better competitors in drier, hotter conditions like xerophytic species. And the failure of these species to move along with this rapidly changing climate, as I mentioned, is likely to reduce forest health, perhaps increase vulnerability and susceptibility to other stressors, as Dave mentioned, like wildfire or insects or diseases, and certainly alter the competitiveness with other species. So instead of massive changes occurring after a large fire, the predictions long-term forest changes, it may take decades, multiple decades, or centuries to change, but change is underway. So one of the other aspects, or the other key message that we talked about, is not just changing forests per se, but how these changing forests are impacting the goods and services that both other natural species rely upon, but equally important, the types of services that we as a society rely on. So our key message too is talking about the impacts of climate change on these ecosystem services. And this little conceptual model I'll just emphasize a few things. One is that, the forest resource in the United States is a blend of public ownership in national forests and parks and nature preserves and those kinds of things. But the majority of the forests in the United States are owned by in the private sector. And so that those impacts are going to impact not only public lands like the Forest Service owns, but also smaller or larger land holdings of private citizens as well. And this occurs across the spectrum of a rural to urban landscape. The private ownership is especially important as we start to talk about adaptation and incentivizing or informing the private landowner of the types of adaptation practices that are possible on their own forest lands. We talked about slow and rapid change, both important, and both are likely to have impacts on things like water quality and quantity, the ability of the systems to store and sequester carbon, the supply of wood and fiber required by us, and our ability to enjoy recreation activities and wildlife habitat. I just want to talk about a few of these. So the first is tree growth. One of the things that's often discussed is that this elevated CO2, which has increased quite substantially over my career. When I started, I remember the CO2 monitor was in our lab was reading about 350, and now it's well over 400. That should increase biomass growth, and in some ecosystems and some trees, there is some evidence to suggest that increased atmospheric CO2 has increased biomass growth. That hasn't happened everywhere and hasn't necessarily been sustained. And what we find is that it really depends on whether the system or the species where these trees or places where these trees are growing are water limited versus energy limited. Under hot and dry and nutrient poor conditions, the CO2 effect is certainly limited or perhaps non-existent because there is not enough water, it's too hot, it's too nutrient poor to take advantage of that higher CO2. In energy limited systems, it may be that the warmer temperatures, higher CO2, longer growing seasons may actually increase growth. And whether that growth can be sustained enough over the long haul will really depend on the other aspect of change, which is heat-related stress, longer-term droughts, what is often called the hot drought, which may in some cases offset, even in energy-limited systems, the elevated, or the warming, the elevated CO2 in the longer growing season. So again, in some cases, increased growth is predicted as has been observed, but how long that will last and how widespread that is really depends on that balance between energy versus water-limited forest systems. Carbon sequestration. One of the biggest challenges to carbon sequestration in the U.S. are disturbances. And I know that figure is a little bit hard to see, but all those colors represent various disturbances that are driving carbon storage patterns in the United States. In the western United States, a lot of the disturbances which are making it difficult to retain carbon are related to fire and insect outbreaks, as Dave noted in some of the previous slides. In the eastern United States, a lot of that changing carbon storage balance is due to forest harvest, but also some pretty big fires. If you look down on the lower right panel, you see some big splotches of red, and those are some places where in the southeast big fires have occurred over the last 10 or 15 years. And those can have some pretty substantial impacts on carbon storage in the eastern United States as well. So using a variety of techniques, primarily models based on the FIA data, our chapter projected that forests will continue to sequester carbon, but at a declining rate because of changing land use, disturbance, and aging forests. A lot of the forests are getting old enough that they are storing carbon at a declining rate, and so that's one of the factors contributing to that those long-term projections for a declining rate of carbon sequestration. The one I think that is of real concern is potential impacts on water resources. And we know that water quality and quantity will be affected by increased temperatures. Some of that related to the associated disturbances like the big wildfire that you see on the right side there, but also things like declining snowpack, which results in earlier snow melt and lower summer flows. But also these warming temperatures substantially increase demand. Demand from people, demand from vegetation, demand for agricultural needs and irrigation. And this declining supply combined with increased demand is likely to cause surface water shortages in dry years, and certainly in some of the drier locations that are already dry.
So far in our presentation,
I'll pass it back over to
sort of
Dave.
the gloom and doom side of our chapter, but I think there's some really good reasons to be hopeful for the future because things are happening right now out on mostly on public lands, a little bit on private lands, that will increase the resilience of our forests to climate change. So there is some good news out there, and that the pace at which this occurs in the future will depend on how committed we are to it. That means it affects our social issues, organizations that institute adaptation, and economic conditions that will support implementation across large landscapes. Whatever we do may help here, even at small scales, but unless we do this at large scales, it won't make too much difference in the long run. So I like to show this cartoon because I think this is how our resource managers often feel. They have some very difficult decisions, but they have to walk through one of those doors. They have to make a decision and implement it. So this is what we're facing right now with climate change adaptation. I mean, it's basically an effort to try to reduce the negative consequences of climate change, but also to transition systems and resources to a warmer climate. We cannot push this away. It's usually better to flow with it and, as shown in the bottom line there, increased resilience. In fact, I think the phrase building resilience will soon replace adaptation in natural resource science. This is just a cartoon of how we see climate change vulnerability assessments being used to provide a foundation for adaptation. With an example here, in this case for fire, showing this moving from left to right in the sequence. There are a number of things we can do. We can reduce fuels. We can reduce forest stand densities with thinning. We can plant drought-tolerant species and genotypes. We can implement better designs for forest roads. And we can use mapping of projected stream temperatures to set priorities for restoration. Now, the great thing is all of these things are going on already across national forests and other public lands throughout the United States. Not as fast and not as far spread as we would like them to be, but they are happening and they are being accepted as institutional norms. We've tried our best to document what we're finding in our assessments as well as in the adaptation options that have been developed. So here's a couple of books that have come out in the last few years. We also put out assessment documentation in Forest Service General Technical Reports. These are written in accessible language for natural resource managers and the public. Lots of diagrams, lots of photos, lots of tables to try to make this information accessible for on-the-ground planning and management. We've also developed what's called the Climate Change Adaptation Library, which I'd invite you to take a look at. It contains over 850 different options for a wide range of resource areas. All of these options were developed by resource managers, not by scientists. So this comes directly from the user community itself. So take a look at that and provide some feedback if you'd like. Just one quick example of something that's on the ground. This is fairly close to where I live in northwest Washington on the Mount Baker-Snoqualmie National Forest, which is using an assessment that we developed to help them improve their travel management. This forest has over 2,000 miles of roads on it. That's a big problem in terms of management. It's a very expensive problem. They use the assessment to help them make decisions on which roads would be viable in the future and could be reasonably maintained, and which roads should be taken out of operation and be decommissioned. So this, like I said before, this information is now being used to make decisions and set priorities in public lands. So we'll stop on that hopeful note, and I don't know if there's time for questions, Katie, but that's the end for our presentation.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Jim. And we can get to questions now. We've got a few more minutes. It looks like Nori asked a question, and so did Ingrid. And Dave went ahead and replied to both of them on text, if you had a chance to read. And then we're down to Michelle Williamson, who asked, Boreas Project, Canadian Forest Service, and NOAA found that bulk of carbon in boreal forests was stored in soils. Trees were a sink when they were actively growing, but a source when they matured and had slow growth rates. Did you evaluate carbon flux rate sources sinks?
This is Jim Vose. I'll answer a little about that. We didn't go into specific ecosystem ecosystems in detail, but certainly well familiar with the strong carbon sink of boreal forest, especially in those soils. One of the biggest threats to that carbon sink, however, is warming in those higher latitudes, and a high risk of rapid decomposition, increased soil respiration, and a loss of a lot of that stored carbon in those colder soils, which are a substantial sink not only in North America but across the globe.
Do you want to add to that?
Jim's the carbon expert here, so no.
Oh, okay. All right. All right. Thanks, Jim. And Jim Wickham, this next question is directed to you from Leslie Cliff. From the first presentation, can you please define downwind precipitation and how the patterns are changing? And Jim, you'll need to unmute.
Yeah, hi. I responded to Leslie on the chat line. Downwind is usually east for most of the United States. Weather mostly comes from the west, but not always. So it would depend on which way the weather is coming from, especially with storms. So.
Okay, thanks, Jim. And Jim Vose mentions one of the risks to carbon storage on boreal forests and warming soils that accelerate soil organic decomposition. One of the risks to carbon is warming soils. Okay, yeah. And then Nori asks, how do we get those books that were just on the last slide? Nori, were you talking about these books, the USDA books, or the climate change books, the Springer books?
Well, anyone who's interested, this is Dave, and anyone who's interested in any of the publications or websites that were mentioned, please just send me an email at wild@uw.edu. That's the last slide. Just send me an email. We'll take care of it.
Great. Thanks, Dave. Then let's see. Oh, yeah, okay. I think we've got, and then Leslie Cliff asked, has anyone heard of any study looking at average size of raindrops, and if how they're changing due to climate change? With lower level storms forming, it seems likely. Any of you would any of you like to take that?
Yeah, this is Jim Vose too. I don't know of any studies, but boy, that's a really important, could be a really important issue as we look at interactions between things like wildfire and then big storms that come after that, because that raindrop size and impact intensity has a big impact on dislodging soil and accelerating erosion. So that'd be a really interesting question to address.
Thanks, Jim. Leslie says, thanks. I find it a very interesting topic, living on the Gulf Coast and watching these storms. Well, we've hit the top of the hour. Are there any other questions? Oh, Michelle's got a question here. Great talk, thanks. Dorian Janie is also typing. Fascinating webinar, thank you. Thanks, guys. Well, Jim, Dave, thanks so much for presenting. Any last words? Katie, any last words?
Sure, if I might, just one last time is to thank our presenters for being here today. We really appreciate your time and all of your efforts. Both of these chapters can be read in full at NCA2018.globalchange.gov. And as I noted before, we've also developed a number of downloadable materials, including overviews, executive summaries, figures, and PowerPoints, and those can all be accessed at nca2018.globalchange.gov/downloads so that you can talk about these chapters as well. And I hope that you'll join us next week for the 4th seminar in our series, which is going to focus ecosystems, agriculture, and rural communities with Sean Carter from USGS and Prasanna Gowda of USDA. Thank you again, everybody, for joining us, and to our presenters, and have a wonderful holiday weekend.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks again, presenters. Bye-bye.